In his ministry, Jesus more than once said that it's not enough to remember his words. People in those times would sometimes follow a rabbi around. They would listen carefully to their words so that they could themselves become teachers and be released out into the world. So the words of a rabbi were seen as all important. They had to be remembered. The rabbi's interpretation of the law, the teaching of the rabbi, was what these disciples were after. But Jesus wanted his disciples to know that remembering his words and his teaching wasn't the most important thing. For him, it was all about putting those words and those teachings into action, letting those words change the way these disciples lived their lives. That was what he wanted from them the most. He says the wise person is one who takes those words and builds their life on them, the one who lets his teaching completely reshape how they view the world and their lives within that world. And that's what Jesus invites us to, a whole new way of being in the world. It was radical and it was challenging then. And it's still radical and challenging today. It challenges every part of our lives. And as we grow up in this world, as we find our way through life, we kind of collect all these kinds of biases and frameworks that we see the world through. Some of the things we gather as we grow up are good. They help us to navigate our way through life, become successful adults. Others, not so good. What Jesus invites us to do is to become aware of those ways in which our biases, our assumptions about this world might harm other people. And this is where the challenge comes into play of Jesus's words. So often we don't really want to see those things in ourselves. We would prefer to be comfortable, to assume that our way of being in this world is correct. We don't like the idea of someone telling us we might need to change. We might need to let go of harmful ways of thinking and behaving, to change our minds. But so often in the Gospels, Jesus has to confront those kinds of attitudes head on. As we read through the stories of those Gospel writers, we encounter him talking to people that other people wouldn't go near. We will hear him debating the interpretations of the law and coming from a very different perspective to those around him. We will see him getting in trouble for doing healings and acts of mercy on the Sabbath. Once again, something you shouldn't be doing. Time and again, Jesus confronts attitudes and assumptions about life, those things that lie just below the surface that so often we're not even aware of. And when you do that, people don't like it. If you look at the reaction that Jesus gets in the Gospels, you'll see just how much all of us resist the idea that we might be wrong. But it's only when we've allowed Jesus to offend us, if you will, to challenge us, to shake us, to provoke us, that we can finally come to deal with those biases and assumptions that we carry with us through life. In our reading this morning from James, we find an example of what this looks like in real life, in a day-to-day life. James is writing a letter to a church, and an issue has arisen in that church that he is writing to. There's a social bias being played out in that church community. And James has found out about this, and he recognizes that this bias is causing harm to this church. Now, we don't know. Perhaps this church didn't realize what they were doing. Perhaps they did realize what they were doing. But James knows he must address this issue head on. And like Jesus, he isn't afraid of the confrontation. and he is not afraid of being bold with his words to wake people up to how their ways of thinking, their biases, are affecting other people's lives. And the bias that really comes to play in this letter that James identifies is called favoritism. Favoritism. Because if we're honest, it's a bias that each of us carries within us. We tend to get on with people who are like us, who are interested in the things we are interested in, who are an appearance like us, who have a habit, who have a personality that is similar to ours. And we tend to struggle with those who are different, those who don't look like us, who think differently to us. We prefer to be around people who make us feel good about ourselves. We like to be with those who can give us things, who build up our lives, that make our lives better. Those things perhaps are normal for human life. But that attitude can take a very dark turn. And that is what James is taking aim at in his letter. This church he's writing to was starting to treat a certain group of people different from everyone else. They were looking and taking the rich people and giving them special honour within their congregation. And those who were poor were almost disregarded completely, almost ignored. And as I say that, and as we've read it from the text, I wonder if that story sounds familiar to you. Because let's be honest, it's been the way of our world for a long time. That is how the story goes so often, doesn't it? That those who are rich have a much better experience of life than those who are poor. The rich get the best seats, they get the nicest food, they are the first in the line, and they are generally treated much better than other people. And that's a story as old as time. But James isn't having any of it. He says, if we are followers of the glorious Lord Jesus Christ, then that way of being in the world cannot continue. In the church, he says, there is no room for such favoritism. He says, if you follow Jesus, then we must imitate him in our lives. That means taking care to notice the people that go unnoticed by the rest of the world. That means going out of our way to treat with honour those people that are rejected by everyone else in the world. It means inviting the people to your gatherings who can offer you nothing in return. It means going to the places that no one else would be caught dead going to. Being with the smelly people, the difficult people, the ones no one else wants to give a space. That is what James is writing about to this church. He is saying to them basically that yes, you may follow the teachings of Jesus, you may love him, you may live as people who call themselves his followers, but your lives in this regard don't look very much like the words and the teaching and the life of Jesus. They have maybe heard his words, but they haven't yet put them into action. In this church, James says, the rich get the best seats while the poor almost become like footstools at people's feet. And James takes them to task and he says, by doing this, you have broken one of the fundamental laws, one of the primary callings of human beings, one of the teachings that Jesus himself said are fundamental and key. Love your neighbour as yourself. It's an understandable mistake. Perhaps their culture was one that was organised around a hierarchy. So those people who mattered were at the top, those people who didn't were at the bottom, and everyone finds their place somewhere on that ladder of society. And if you're somewhere in the middle, you wanted to get as many of those people who mattered into your life so that your family could start moving up the ladder. You would butter up the rich and powerful. You would give them the preferential seats in your church, in your home, so that one day they might do the same for you. You might find favour in their eyes. They would help you climb up the social ladder. You would want people around you to see that you have these people in your gatherings. So in that society, only certain people were useful. Only certain people mattered. And again, as I say that, the sad reality is that we are still prone to that basic error today, aren't we? We might think that we've come a long way since that time, but those fundamental attitudes are still the same. If you look at the systems and structures of our society, it's still those people who are rich who are given priority over the poor. And even in many of our churches, we are still guilty of that sin of favoritism, that we allow things like financial giving to override that primary calling to be with and for the poor. We have that bias within us against certain kinds of people, particularly those who can give nothing to us in return. We still feel uncomfortable around some kinds of people. So I'm going to show you a picture now of a statue that was put outside a Catholic college in Canada. And I'm just going to show you the picture and ask you what you think might be going on. This statue was crafted by the Canadian artist Timothy Schmaltz, and it's called Homeless Jesus. You may have seen it. It was replicated in various places around the world. But if you were to get close to that statue, you would notice that in the feet of that man on the bench there are 2 holes. But only if you get close. From a distance, it looks like any other person sleeping under a dirty blanket on a bench. And the artist is trying to make a point, and I think the point is fairly clear, that that figure represents the whole group of people that we so easily walk past. That sleeping homeless man on the bench. But underneath that dirty blanket, if we dare to get close enough, we would see Jesus himself. And I think that's a very powerful statement, isn't it? It prompts us to question again our biases and our assumptions. Are we any further on than the church that James was writing to? Do we today still give preferential treatment to some, ignoring the very people that Jesus has called us to serve? Are there groups of people that we would rather just not come because it makes us uncomfortable? James is writing to us today just as much as he was to that church all those years ago. So the challenge for us followers of Jesus today is quite clear, I think. Will we allow his words to shape our whole lives? Will we let our assumptions and our biases be challenged by his ways and give up on all those prejudices that we carry against others? Will we pay attention to the people he has sent us to? I want to invite you to spend some time this week just thinking through all these things. Go back to that chapter 2 of James and read those words again. Take some moments to ponder what kinds of people perhaps do you struggle to be around? Where in life are you uncomfortable being around certain kinds of others? Think about the people in your life who you find it really difficult to get along with. Think about the people you see as you go through life, the homeless, the poor, those who struggle with life, who might be rejected by others. And ask Jesus to open your eyes, to give you vision to see the ways that people are treated in our world. and allow him to start challenging those things within us that help us to hide from the reality, but that actually diminish our lives. And I pray that as we go through life, as we face the challenge of Jesus' words again, that we might find the courage to follow him, not just listening to his words, not just remembering them, but putting them into action in our day-to-day lives. Amen.